let's talk about this match day. I think there's lots of interesting things to talk about, and we wanted to kick things off with which we said this on the beginning of the show. It's getting a little boring, but I think it's such a big elephant in the room that we really cannot ignore it this time around. Borussia Dortmund. We spent a lot of time talking about them midweek after the defeat to Real Madrid, which was, by any stretch of the imagination, completely avoidable, right? The fact that they were up 2 goals and then Sahin made some significant coach changes from the bench that cost them more or less the game. Um, the joke that we had midweek was that, oh, watch, Dortmund are going to beat Real Madrid and lose to Augsburg. They, of course, lose to Real Madrid and then also get beaten by Augsburg. And I think this was a very disheartening performance that, you can't really discuss it that way anymore. We're beyond the transition period now. I think you put it on Threads or one of those many social medias that we nowadays have to follow because of what happened to X. This is Dortmund's worst start. In how many years, Stefan? You put it really well.
In 11 seasons.
11 seasons. So I think that's the last year on the club that was the only one that was worse, which was like a statistical anomaly, really, when you look back on it. Some really bad match luck. So yeah, it's really strange what's going on. I think we can no longer discuss it away, and I think we're getting to the point now where we really have to question whether it was the right idea to go with Nuri Sahin to begin with.
Yeah, it's definitely getting to that point. I think this season with Dortmund, where fans are already questioning, where they go from here, how do they move on from two really bad results. And the kind of troubling thing is, we've been saying this for much of the season so far, is that you're really struggling to kind of see what Nuri Sahin is trying to build at Dortmund. It's not even so much the case that he's come in with some very bold tactics and, they've been missing their targets by narrow margins, or that key players who are crucial to those systems have been missing. They definitely have had their injury concerns, of course they have, but it's not as if this team has been made their break on the fact that Gio Reyna's been out injured, or Julian Duranville or Jan Couto or whatever. It's still a team that's really struggling to kind of really put in performances. And watching that Augsburg game, I was really struck by how passive Dortmund remain, how unresponsive, how unthreatening, how undominating they are. They just don't look like a team who think they should be arguably the second biggest club in Germany. They certainly don't look like the second biggest club in Germany. If you ask anyone who's never watched German football, doesn't know anything about soccer, football, don't know anything about German football or the geography of Germany or anything like that, to watch that game and ask them to say who are traditionally the second biggest club in Germany, at least one of the biggest clubs, maybe not historically speaking, they would probably have said Augsburg, because they were a team who I thought took the game to Dortmund for most of the match. And yeah, you could say that's because they're at home. But after Dortmund scored that opening goal, which was a wonderful kind of 1-2 between Girassi and Malen, you kind of thought, okay, they're here to bounce back. They're going to kind of exercise some demons. They're going to inflict some sort of revenge on the footballing gods via Augsburg, who are just unfortunate bystanders in what was a very kind of worrying performance against Real Madrid, much like Bayern did to Bochum the following day, which we'll get on to. And it just didn't happen. They scored an opening goal, and then Dortmund just sat back, and they just invited Augsburg to continue approaching, and then to the point where Alex Claude Maurice just decided to kind of take a shot because no one was coming anywhere near him, and it was a tremendous goal. And you kind of thought, okay, maybe this is just people score tremendous goals from time to time. It wasn't really a goal that Dortmund could have really defended tremendously well. It's not as if it was like a kind of they passed through Dortmund's defence. It's just a kind of pot shot that went in. So Dortmund could easily kind of brush themselves off, pull themselves up, brush themselves off, and get on with it. But they didn't.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that kind of just stood out to me time and time again in this game. At no point did Dortmund have any interest in just kind of exerting their control in this game. They constantly lost the ball. They constantly dribbled into cul-de-sacs. They were constantly looking like a team of individuals. And I thought the player who was more so than that than anyone else was Jamie Gittins. And I don't want to say that as a critique of him, but he lost the ball, I think 5 or 6 times over the course of the game, more than any other player in the Dortmund pitch. Maybe Julian Brandt lost it more. And these guys, and we've talked about this over and over and over again with Dortmund, where it just seems like they're a team of individuals. They're a team where Nuri Sahin is just simply saying, just go out, do what you guys can do, and let's hope that someone has the imagination or the innovation or the talent to just basically win a game for us. And that's basically what got them through games when Karim Adeyemi was fit before his injury, because he was in tremendous form. It's what kind of allowed them to pull ahead against Dortmund, because Daniel Malin and Sergio Garassi have formed some sort of tremendous partnership up front. But aside from that, there's just no kind of real impetus to kind of try and dominate the match. And I was trying to figure if I could kind of put hammer in the nail in the head, I guess the expression I'm trying to think of. What is it that's specifically going wrong? And if I had to kind of pick any area of that team that I think is the issue, and you could really pick any, to be honest with you, I actually think it might be in central midfield. I think, in this game in particular, it was Sabitzer and Nemcha who started, which is the same against Real Madrid. Both of them are certainly capable of doing things. They're both certainly capable of being decent box-to-box players, but I wouldn't say either of them have really been consistently good this season by any stretch of the imagination. Emre Can equally continues to come in and does a dreadful job of it. I think he's been atrocious this season. And then there's Pascal Gross, who was signed as this kind of really interesting blockbuster signing. Yeah, maybe not the most expensive signing in the world, but a player who has obviously garnered a huge amount of respect for playing for the German national team and for what he's done in the Premier League. And he's been more or less dropped in recent weeks by Nuri Sahin. And if you kind of look at those 4 players, and it's more or less those 4 players because there's no one else who can really slot in there, every single one of them has been well below par this season. And I wonder if that's kind of the crux of the issue here, where Dortmund just simply don't have any decent central midfielders who can kind of exert their dominance on a game and allow them to dominate these matches, because they continually drop points. Even the games they win. We talked about this against Heidenheim. I think it was Bochum as well, actually, at the Westfalenstadion. That game, I think they won 4-2 maybe. Both those games, they only won them because they were able to outscore their opponents. At no point were they actually in control of those games. And it's now got us to this point where, Dortmund, they don't look convincing at all, and there's some serious question marks over Nuri Sahin's future at the club.
Can I be honest with you? I think it's the right ingredients, but the wrong cook. That's how I feel about it. I think that I go through the squad list and I look at what they did this summer, and I thought they did a tremendous job bringing in the players that they brought in. I think Pascal Gross was the right signing. I think Maximilian Bayer was the right signing. The fact that they really seem to strengthen in so many areas that really needed strength from Guirassy. We were wondering about whether he was going to be a one-hit wonder or not. In fairness, this has not been on him. He's been scoring the goals, and he's been scoring the sort of goals that they've been lacking. So I think Sabitzer is a player that is extremely useful. I think Nemcha has his use. Emre Can, okay, fine. I don't think, at the end of the day, how many disasters does it need to take until finally the last person in Dortmund wakes up to the realization that this is maybe not going to work out. But I think other than that, there's all the right ingredients are there. And yes, there's some injury concerns. Duran will out, and obviously Adeyemi being out, that really hurts them. But I think in Pascal Gross, they signed a guy that gave some indication of where they wanted to go tactically. Right? They wanted to have more possession. They wanted to hold on to the ball. They wanted to play the sort of football that Hutzler plays with Brighton now, or did with St. Pauli last year. They wanted to do the sort of you sort of do the same things and then Sebastian Hoeneß does with Stuttgart, some elements of Javi Alonso. That was I think the idea that was cooked up in the upper echelons of the Borussia Dortmund hierarchy, and the architect of that was supposed to bring all these elements together and construct this a team out of the what I think is the right pieces, is the head coach, is Nuri Sahin. Ultimately, they got together right at the end of last season, and they had to sit down with Edin Terzic, and they decided, okay, well, Edin, you're no longer the guy. We don't think that you can do the things that are necessary to bring this team forward. There was some sort of disagreement, right? And so they opted to go with Nuri Sahin instead, who was partly in charge together with Edin Terzic towards the tail end of last season, and probably did play a big role in the club reaching the Champions League final. But the end of the day, the way that they play football then doesn't really fit the pieces that they brought in, right? So if Nuri Sahin was a big part of the tactical setup that got Dortmund there, how did they play? They didn't play possession-based, proactive football. They played reactionary football. I mean, that worked because they faced so many teams that were just better than them in the Champions League, and they made the most out of that. But at the end of the day, if you want to play the sort of football that Stuttgart play or that Leverkusen play that made them successful, or we're going to talk about Leipzig as well, who silently have become Bayern Munich's number one hunter. They all play a very different type of football and a very much more proactive type of football with much more possession and much more structure. I think what's really missing here is structure, and I think at the end of the day, the guy that gives a team structure is the guy on the bench, and it's not there. And it's now been 8 games, right? When you look at the table today, Borussia Dortmund are 7th. Yes, only 2 points out of what is the bare minimum for Hans-Joachim Watzke, which is 4th place. It probably helps them that Union and Frankfurt are each dropping points at the moment, but they're 7 points behind the top of the table. And that is simply not good enough for the stature of the club that you are. And you just wonder, at what point do you say this experiment has failed? Because I know the arguments, and we all have been there with these arguments over and over. We've witnessed those arguments. Like, let's sit this out. There's still time, all that sort of stuff. But if you bring in a new head coach now, you can still turn around a season that is slowly but surely turning into a disappointment. And I think the right thing sometimes is to cut your losses early and make the right adjustment at the place that can make the biggest impact. And I think that's the head coach right now.
Yeah, there's serious question marks over all of it. And as you said, if you kind of take a look at, they're not particularly outstanding in the attacking sense, and not particularly outstanding in the defensive sense. Yeah. I think there's serious question marks over the squad, to be honest with you. I mean, I do take your point that they did quite well in the summer, but if you kind of look at the players have had to kind of step up this season. Like for example, if you look at which players have played the most minutes so far this season, Emre Can is, I think, 7th. Niklas Sula's there, Rami Benzebaini. Straight off the bat, 3 players I think are simply not good enough for Dortmund. I think Niklas Sula has well and truly kind of nailed the last nail in his coffin. In terms of his career at Dortmund this season, his performances, they've been well below par. Emre Can equally the same. Yeah. The fact that they started this season with Benzebaini as the only genuine left back in that squad. I know Rierson can technically play there, and maybe the plan was that they sign Jan Kutu as a right back and Rierson plays at left back, but that's still you starting a season with a right-footed player in your left back position. And then you only have to kind of go through that team. Like I said, I'm not sure those midfielders are simply good enough. And, you then come on to those forward players. And I think maybe the issue as well is that you've got 3 or 4 players there who can technically play across a front 3 and can technically play on the wing, but none of them are actually wingers in the traditional sense. Jamie Gittins is a player who loves to cut inside and shoot. That's what he's on that team to do. He's not there to kind of hit the byline and swing crosses in and set up chances for other players. Equally, Daniel Malen is more or less a second striker. The success he's had so far at Dortmund has basically been playing, like we said, against Augsburg as a 1-2 against with Sergio Garassi. playing off Guirassy as a second striker, not as a winger. And Karim Adeyemi is a perfect example of that too, where he's done really well this season, but he's a goal scorer, not a playmaker. And actually, as you were talking there, I quickly checked just to double check for myself, and I think what's quite interesting is if you kind of look at which players have completed the most passes into the box this season, you've got Julian Brandt, who's 7th, and this is something that's been the case at Dortmund for 4 or 5 years now. I've definitely wrote this article a number of times, but if you take Julian Brandt out of that Dortmund team, there's no one in that team who puts the ball into the net. Puts the ball into the box for other players. Julian Brandt, 7th in the Bundesliga. The next Dortmund player on that list is Pascal Groß at 32nd.
And they signed him specifically to help with that. I mean, that's specifically why they brought Pascal Groß in, to help with that, right? So
yeah, and he's, like you said, he's kind of coming in out of the team, and it just feels like nothing's working. I think you'll see his question marks over that squad. There's huge problems. I think, yes, maybe when everyone's fit, they can put a very strong starting 11, but if you're having to rely on guys like Emre Can, you're having to rely on guys like Niklas Süle, you're having to rely on other players in that team. You could even arguably say guys like Felix Nemcha Felix Nemcha hasn't really, I would say, proven that he's a consistent Dortmund player yet. Niklas Süle hasn't proven that he's a consistent Dortmund player yet. I think it says a lot about the club right now that someone like Julian Rierson, who in years gone past, if you want to go back all the way back to the Klopp heyday, Rierson would have just simply been a useful squad player who works very hard. As I said before, the Kevin Grosskreutz type player. But the fact that he's more or less one of their best performing players this season, one of their most consistent players this season, isn't so much a compliment to him, but it's a negative insult to the rest of the squad that Rierson is, running rings around the number of these players. So, yeah, it's a difficult question. I think Dortmund need a lot to do. They need to fix a lot in this team. I think from a start 11 point of view, maybe they can put out one of the strongest teams in the league, but in terms of an actual squad, it doesn't surprise me that they're struggling for a top 4 finish here. And maybe if you had an experienced head coach who knew what he was doing, a head coach who'd been here and done it all before, maybe he could get the best out of the squad. But you can't hire Nuri Sahin, who's an inexperienced head coach, who's never coached this level, and who, by the way, was also second in command to the guy last season who was deemed to have not done the job properly, and ask him to perform miracles with a squad. It's just Dortmund basically not doing anywhere near enough to achieve to get to where they want to be.
Yeah, but can we identify what Nuri Sahin football is at this stage?
No, absolutely not.
That's just it. There's, in Germany you say die Handschrift, right? There's no handwriting over it, and I just don't see it. I don't understand what Nuri Sahin football is. He's a nice guy, was a great midfielder in his heyday, but I don't get it. I don't see it. I don't understand what's going on here. And I just would like to see a little bit of ambition here, maybe, for once. And maybe hire someone who, maybe think outside the box and bring in a head coach who maybe stands for something. Be a bit more innovative and be a bit more forward thinking, and I just don't see it. And as long as that kind of thinking prevails at Borussia Dortmund, and as long we will talk about it, and we can be bored about the topic as much as we want to. Germany's second largest club by revenue and standing and fan membership, etc., is going to be this sort of same procedure as every match day kind of thing, right? And so here we are. And it's I think for if you're neutral and watch the Bundesliga, it's extremely frustrating because you just want them to do better, and you want them to be. I always remember. And this was years ago, Hans-Joachim Watzke doing this big meeting at the one of the annual general meetings, right? One of the big AGMs, and he does this big PowerPoint presentation, as they love to do them in Germany. And He said, one day we're going to be that second big lighthouse of German football next to Bayern Munich. And I'm like, then behave like it. You know, like just behave like that lighthouse, behave like that beacon or that you want to be. And then like, don't do this wishy-washy stuff. And that's, I think, really frustrating for a lot of German football fans.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's going to take some serious question marks. We've been quite critical of the Dortmund board for some time now. You know, Vasquez obviously is moving on, but he's hired his own successor, which I'm not sure which other industries people are looking to do that. Yeah, exactly. And we might see a kind of Uli Hoeneß situation where he's still kind of pulling the strings from his non-executive role on the board or whatever. But to me, Dortmund not only need a new head coach, but they need a clear sporting director who knows what he's doing with that team, because you only have to, I mean, yes, they brought in some good players this season, but why are they spending 18 million euros on a centre forward to then spend another 30 million euros on another centre forward when the head coach has made it clear he's only going to play one centre forward a week? Dortmund aren't really in a position to spend, 50 million euros on two players when they know only one of them's ever going to start from one week to the next. It'd be one thing if they could find some system like we've seen with Leipzig where they play, Openda and Sesko up front, and Max Bayer can maybe play out wide and play off Guirassy. But that hasn't happened. And the fact that their team was crying out for central midfielders, it was crying out for proper fullbacks. And all Dortmund did that in that window was sign Jan Kuto on loan and pick up Pascal Gross for 7 million euros. These are decent guys, are decent players. They obviously might go on to become really important players for Dortmund this season, but it doesn't feel like there was any kind of joined up, connected thinking between the recruitment team and the head coach. And that simply might be because Nuri Sahin doesn't have the gravitas, so he doesn't have the CV to walk into Dortmund and say, I need these guys, get it done, or I'm out here. And this is I think this is the recurring problem with Dortmund. They keep hiring these head coaches who are routinely below the station of Borussia Dortmund, so they're just happy to be there. That's what Nuri Sahin was. That's what Edin Terzic was. You can go through more or less every single head coach on that list since Thomas Tuchel, except Marco Rose maybe. And every single one of them was just delighted that they had a job at Dortmund. They're just delighted that they're head coach at Dortmund.
Favre.
Sorry?
I did think Favre was a really good appointment too.
Yeah. But very recently, the most recent ones, obviously, Terzic and Nuri Sahin are just happy to be there. And probably weren't speaking up when they said, guys, we've got Benzema. Is the only left back in this squad, and we're going into an expanded Champions League format, and with a team full of players who pick up injuries left, right, centre. But anyway, we could probably spend another 40 minutes talking about Dortmund here. But it'd be good to hear what some Dortmund fans thinking, whether they think Sahin's a problem or whether replacing him with someone else would even make a difference.
Yeah, and replace him with whom, right? That's the other question.